Thanks, Nikki, and good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces. But for those who don't know me, my name's Nick King. I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies, as well as running my own public policy consultancy called Kenney. My background's in government. I did about 6 years as special advisor in 3 different departments, including the Department for Business and the Department of what was then Communities and Local Government, where we spent a lot of time thinking about what we now call levelling up. And I think that phrase is a relatively new one, but some of the concepts and issues which sit behind it are obviously old and pretty existential ones. Obviously, the last few governments, whether the coalition government, David Cameron's short-lived government, or the Brown and Blair administrations, all talked warm words about what they wanted to do to address regional imbalances. But if anything, those regional imbalances have become worse and more pronounced over years and decades. But I think, although those issues are old ones and have existed for some time, and the ambition to address them is one that's gone on for some time, what is new with this government is the centrality of this levelling up agenda. And there wasn't much doubt about its centrality before Boris Johnson's speech earlier this year and before Conservative Party conference, but it's very, very obvious now that it's absolutely something which this government wants to be measured on and assessed by its ability to tackle some of these issues that we conceive of as levelling up. I think actually we look at different individuals, different organisations, all different departments are trying to carve and create their own levelling up story at the moment. And in some ways that could be seen as a strength because there's lots of different levers that can be pulled, but perhaps also it's a bit of a weakness because what we're struggling to achieve at the moment is a real idea of what levelling up is, what constitutes it, and what might achieve it. Some of us have been thinking about these issues for a long time. As I say, more than 2 years ago, my organisation published this report, A Rising Tide, which particularly looked at the role of the private sector in levelling up the British economy and how it can drive economic success and performance around the country. But rather than reading that, very good though it is, I would advise you all to wait what I hope will be a short matter of time before the government publishes its own Levelling Up white paper. And we're very lucky to have Tom Walker with us today, one of the main architects of that Levelling Up white paper, as well as 2 other subject experts on either side of me. So we're going to start by asking each of the 3 panellists to make some introductory remarks about levelling up and how they perceive that issue and how they'd address it. Then we'll have a bit of a Q&A on stage before I come to the audience for both points, comments and questions, and we'll look to finish by 4:10. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Tom, who is Director of the Levelling Up Taskforce, which I think I'm right in saying, Tom, sits now between Cabinet Office and Deluxe. One of the big issues of the day is how we pronounce that acronym, but I'm sure Tom can clarify that and hopefully give us a little bit of an inside track about what's coming. Tom.
Thank you very much, Nick. Nick and I used to work together when Nick was Sajid's special advisor. I might say more about that actually later. People ask me all sorts of questions. The main one is which department do you sit in? That's an easy one to answer. In the Cabinet Office, working to Michael Gove, and Andy Haldane is now in post. I'll say something about that as well. The question I can't answer precisely is when is the white paper going to be published, and therefore I'll keep some comments pretty high level, but very happy to engage in some discussion as we go. So a few things and pointers and reflections. I should also say I joined the Department of the Environment, Transport and the Regions in 1998, a newly formed super ministry with a very powerful Secretary of State, and I joined the Regional Policy Unit, setting up the regional development agencies. That is not a clue to what might happen, just to be clear, but I have worked on these issues a long time, since being a very junior person to slightly more senior. Now, as it happens, and we might hear more about this from Party Conference, those who were there, Neil O'Brien has published a piece in The Guardian. If you want to know what levelling up is, read Neil O'Brien's piece in The Guardian. It's the best and clearest guide, and it sets out 4 broad outcomes, which are to empower local leaders to raise living standards, in particular to grow the private sector where it's thinnest, to spread opportunity and improve public services, and to restore local pride. Now, there'll be loads of questions. Okay, well, that's great, but what do they mean, and how are you going to measure, and how are you going to show, etc., etc. That is what the white paper is for. But I do think that definition takes things beyond the Prime Minister's speech and starts to give a sort of framework which crucially is broader than just the local growth agenda. That's the main point about Levelling Up. So I ran the Cities and Local Growth Unit for 3.5 years. Others did some of the groundwork, but essentially took on Michael Heseltine's No Stone Unturned report, which was published 9 years ago, almost this week, and led that agenda on city devolution, on enterprise zones, on LEPs. That is a narrower version of Levelling Up. It's an important part of Levelling Up. See points 1 and 2 on my list of outcomes, but Levelling Up is a broader ambition. So the definitive guide, sort of as it stands, other than all the excellent think tank reports and commentary that we have, is Neil's piece in The Guardian. It's short, but if you're looking for it, it's there. Then other pointers. The Secretary of State gave an interview in The Sun 1 or 2 weeks after the reshuffle, and there he used the analogy of when a school teacher takes over a failing school, what the first things they do, they change the school uniform, they may change the school motto, the head teacher, and the teachers start wearing jackets and ties. That's the sort of Michael Gove metaphor. And to get Levelling Up right, you've got to inject confidence into places, so visible, impactful measures are as important as the long-term agenda. So Michael Gove's commentary, obviously, and through some of the things that were said at the conference, is the other yardstick to where the agenda might emerge. Having put that emphasis on sort of short-term improvement, I think the one thing you can take away, and this is from the Prime Minister's speech, is there's a really serious recognition that this is a long-run agenda tackling some very deep-rooted and structural problems in the economy. So those are two guides. The other, helpful as it happens, set of guides are Andy Haldane's work, both at the Industrial Strategy Council, but in a number of reports and think tanks. What did the Industrial Strategy Council report say on this? To summarise a great body of work, the three lacking things in regional policy have been longevity, lack of scale, and lack of coordination on the ground. So if you take The Guardian, The Sun, and Andy's reports, you see the structure of what the Levelling Up agenda is, and we will produce a white paper soon that puts more detail on that. A couple more points just before handing over. I've already said it's long term, and I've already said it's broader than a local growth agenda. The other challenge, and for me this is quite interesting, I've worked on and off this agenda for nearly 23 years. I went this summer for the first time professionally to Scotland, to Northern Ireland and to Wales. I've been there obviously non-professionally, but the point of saying that is it's a union-wide agenda, and again you get that from the Prime Minister's speech, you get it in the creation of the new department, but that throws up all sorts of challenges about how you deliver these agendas within the devolved settlements. And for those of you who don't follow it closely, bits of the Constitution Group in the Cabinet Office under Sue Gray have been moved into the new Department for Levelling Up as well. Other things that I might just touch on, I mean there'll be loads of theory. Andy is bringing that into the work that we're doing. We were doing it anyway, but that will be enhanced, particularly the role of different capitals, so not just focusing on infrastructure. Others on the panel might say something about this, the importance of social capital. And then I think whatever a white paper says, the other things that I've done, so I helped lead Homes England for 2 years as the Deputy CEO. I worked on the housing market renewal Pathfinder programme, much maligned often, but I think some seeds of actually some very good work. I led the neighbourhood planning, taking it from the legislative stage to 1,000 communities across the country. And in the end, to make success of this agenda is actually quite a lot about how you drive things in real places, with local leaders, with businesses, with communities. And so a part of our work, and it's to Andy's third point really about the lack of policy coordination on the ground, is I think orienting Whitehall and the way that we do business in central government to a more place-based arrangement. We won't be the first people to say that, but I think, as Nick has already said, there's a centrality to this mission and some very particular geographies that the government is interested in that make that a necessity. So I'm happy to sort of take comments as we go on all of that, but I hope that gives you a few pointers of where to look, inevitably ahead of a white paper document, which will put all detail on.
Thanks, Tom. And the thorny issue of how we pronounce the acronym?
I say DLUC.
There you are. There you have it. Michael is Professor of Public Policy, University of Cambridge, with the Bennett Institute. Michael, over to you.
Thanks very much. So I'm just going to offer a few thoughts. I think I'm due to speak for about 5 minutes. Rather fatally, I don't have a clock or watch in front of me, so just nudge me or hit me if I go over. I'll try and keep it brief. First of all, really good to be here today and good to be talking again to people about this in person. First thing I'll say is just a little bit of a shameless plug. I'm a director at the Bennett Institute, and we've done quite a bit of work that has a bearing on levelling up or speaks directly to this very broad agenda. In fact, just last week, I think it was, we brought out a collection of short pieces which are all based on research or experience of practitioners, which I, of course, would heartily recommend. But actually, I was ticking off as Tom was going through a number of the different issues that are addressed in that collection. So that's, if you want, our collected thoughts on the subject. I'm just going to give you my tuppence worth on a few issues. The first is about history. It does seem to me that I really welcome the way in which Tom set this up, not just his own history in relation to this, but also the importance of seeing this, the need to see this as the latest in quite a long line of attempts to tackle some of the really intractable challenges, or problems that have felt intractable around the divergence in regional economic development in the UK. And I mean, often that history is quite summarily dismissed as one entirely of failure. That is wrong. It's a very nuance needs to be brought to that history. There are lessons to be learned. There are things to be learned in terms of what not to do, I think, as well as insights there. I was heartened just in conversation with Stephen Aldridge just before, who I think feels the same point. This is, I think, a very important resource we have that can actually orientate some of the strategic work and thinking that ought to go into levelling up. A couple of points specifically. One is that it seems to me we need to think about which have been the assumptions governing public policy that have not necessarily helped us, or that have skewed policy and created some of the challenges, some of the problems that we're now trying to deal with. I think particularly it's interesting to hear the point about theory, Tom, because I know this is something Andy's very interested in, but the whole perspective around the economic theory of agglomeration, and which has been very influential in the UK and other countries as well, which has undoubtedly has shaped policymakers' thinking about where growth is to be attained and how it can be promoted, typically in large, denser populated urban areas. Whilst, I mean, there is, I think, a pretty compelling body of evidence that undoubtedly works in the context of London and the South East. Elsewhere in the UK, agglomeration is variable, to say the least, and I think there are certain areas where cities like Newcastle, which we looked at in some of our work on the towns, as well as regions like the Southwest, where an agglomeration story is not going to get you to the kind of understanding of the challenges faced by many places, people within those cities, but also living in their hinterlands. There is, I think, a strong case for a much greater policy focus on our second-tier cities, which do comparatively underperform economically compared to many other, particularly European contexts, the US as well. Then I think as well, the point about timescales, which Tom mentioned, is really interesting, and to think about that in historical terms. If you look not just in the UK here, but more widely, we throw the net more widely, I mean, major regeneration programs of this kind of ambition are few and far between in terms of those that have been unadulterated successes. The example that I notice has crept into a lot of political discourse is East Germany, and that is a very interesting example to look at, but it obviously has taken 30 years, and based on I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but it looks to me like there are still pretty significant gaps there as well. So, you know, that really is the long term, and I think you're right to emphasise that there are different timescales that are running here. Some of the big physical infrastructure projects that have emerged as sort of favourite items of this Prime Minister, but also of policymakers for some while in the UK, those yield benefits over quite a long time period. So, you know, it's fine to sort of focus on those, but it's unlikely that they are going to, again, address some of the more immediate challenges here. I think there's a more fundamental point, which is that I think there's a growing recognition in the academic community that whilst agglomeration is clearly a very important determinate set of processes, even if agglomeration effects were happening across the UK's leading cities, we'd still have problems in many of those towns outside those urban cores, in our rural areas, on our urban peripheries. So those challenges, those places require different sorts of policy strategy and approach. And that's one of the reasons why we've looked at the Bennett Institute at the importance of social infrastructure, which is a term that's become quite prominent of late. We're not alone at all in doing that, and there's a very interesting panoply, I think, of different reports, pieces of work, including excellent work by Vidhya's organisation, which are all arguing in quite similar ways. There's small disagreements, but really we're all arguing very similarly for the overriding importance of attending to social infrastructure as well as big physical infrastructure and somewhat separately to transport connectivity, and to thinking about the potential benefits this might yield over a shorter time horizon. In the work that we did, we sort of, essentially it's a sort of review of available evidence. We were very struck that there are different kinds of benefit, that even relatively small investments in the social fabric of communities, either restoring that social fabric or improving the offer that's made to local people in terms of amenities, facilities, spaces, those kind of investments clearly have economic benefits of various primarily indirect kinds. So you can see that in terms of skills, employment. Social infrastructure actually is a reasonably large employer in many towns. More generally, there are important network effects of improved amenities in a place. Considerable health benefits, really striking data, correlations, particularly I think most interestingly around mental health. And issues like loneliness. There is a strong correlation between, in particularly in struggling places, those towns or communities that have better infrastructure, have more facilities, more amenities, more stuff to do, more opportunities to interact, tend to have better aggregate level outcomes on those health measures. And then social capital more generally, that there's huge benefits to be accrued from social capital generation. Two final points, if I may. One is just, I think, going to the pride in place idea, which you mentioned there, Tom. I think one of the really interesting things, this is often kind of slightly dismissively referred to as hanging baskets and, sort of very cosmetic changes to places. I think that is overly dismissive. I think those kind of, those sorts of policies, small-scale interventions can make a big difference. Seems to me that one way to open this up would be to think about this in terms of local institutions. Which are the places, the institutions, the spaces that really matter in a place and that people connect with, and that it forms a part of the basis of their feeling about the place in which they live. And I think that could actually really open that agenda up to really be something quite substantive. My final point is just on local leadership. I just wanted to mention this because I think it's been really welcome that in both Michael Gove and Neil O'Brien's interventions, this has been specified, it's been picked out as one of the big themes of Levelling Up. And that obviously leads us into a discussion of devolution, which we might have in the Q&A. But also I think is important in its own right. It goes beyond the roles of formally elected leaders or leaders of local government. It's important because if you want to harness the detailed knowledge and understanding of communities and their needs, you need to do that by tapping into locally rooted leaders and indeed communities, and I know Vidhya will talk about that. The second point is that the profile of inequalities in many towns and cities in the UK is often very localised. And local leadership is needed to grasp those challenges and devise tailored answers. So I will leave it there.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. We'll explore some of those issues, I'm sure, in the Q&A, in particular that connection with devolution, which seems so important. If you're going to get the right local leadership, you need to put the right powers and funding into their hands. Finally, before we go into Q&A, I'd like to ask Vidhya Alakeson, who's the Chief Executive of Power to Change, to talk a little bit more about that social and civic agenda, which Michael has just talked about.
Great, thanks, Nick, and lovely to be here. Just one word about Power to Change. So we're an independent trust that was established 6 years ago, and our mission is to drive up the creation and the spread of community-led businesses across the country and the community ownership of assets. So we're very much in the community space and also the sort of a lot of what we support is the creation of social infrastructure in towns and villages and communities across the country. So I just wanted to focus on 4 bits of evidence that I hope, I'm going to be looking at Tom every time I say something to see whether he nods or shakes his head, but hope might be framing some of the thinking that have very much influenced our sort of work on levelling up and the influencing we've been trying to do on this agenda. So I think the first, and Mike sort of alluded to some of this, the first is that I think it's now demonstrably the case that there's growing evidence and work of Onward and others has sort of really tried to strengthen this, that places are held back by weaknesses in their social fabric as well as in their kind of economic indicators, and there is an interplay between the two. So policy is often focused on one set of outcomes or the other, and actually it's very clear, I think, that long-term regeneration needs to have a strong focus on both strengthening social fabric and social infrastructure as part of that, as well as on the kind of more economic outcomes that we tend to focus on. And I think for those of us that have been banging the kind of social infrastructure, social fabric drum for a while now, it feels heartening that some of the fears that we had maybe a year or so ago, that actually the focus of levelling up was very much about big infrastructure, R&D spend, was sort of very focused at the regional level, seems to have changed, and I'm sort of guardedly optimistic that some of this stuff has landed and the agenda has moved on. I think the second thing was really building on what Mike said about social infrastructure. I mean, our view from the work that we've done is that much social infrastructure is built and maintained at the neighbourhood level by those rooted local leaders that Mike's alluded to. And I think I can see sort of Molly in the front row here from the British Academy. One of the things that I felt very powerful in the British Academy study that they did about sort of the decade post-COVID was the importance to national resilience of that local community-based infrastructure. So I think one of the things that had troubled me for a while about the sort of rhetorical focus of levelling up being very much regional, a kind of focus on combined authorities, on LEPs, was the recognition that actually a lot of the local strength of places is really built at the neighbourhood level and built by very locally embedded leaders, and it's their intelligence that often leads to the success of that infrastructure. And I think the third point is really looking at previous regeneration efforts. There are a number of studies now that have tried to sort of gather the learning from what's happened in the past, whether it's a New Deal for Communities, Single Regeneration Budget, all of those previous attempts. And I think what comes out very strongly is a meaningful role for communities in terms of decision-making, even control of budgets, governance structures that have communities playing an integral part are intimately linked to the success of those regeneration efforts long-term. So I think that's a really important sort of learning to build into what we do going forward. And then fourth is more a sort of political point, really. It's like increasingly clear from polling that people will judge the success of levelling up from the visible changes that they can see in their local communities. And this is where it then defaults to bunting and hanging baskets. But that's not what people are talking about, although the Jubilee will inevitably involve a lot of hanging baskets and bunting. But they're talking about, are the shops on their high street open? Are the local services open? Is there a pub again? Is there a post office? Is there a tangible change in the physical fabric of the place where they live that they can see and experience? And so I think inevitably this is both a long-term agenda, as Tom said, but also a political agenda, and I think that people need to pay attention to that. So what am I hoping for out of the white paper? I think the 2 points that aren't really touching on the civic sort of community space. The first is I'd be really excited if there was more focus in the white paper on innovation in public services. I think there's been, and I'll say specifically why, particularly around education. So, a huge part, and Tom sort of said, one of the key dimensions of this is spreading opportunity and public services. And I think to do that, we need greater innovation in our education system. Some of the things that are already coming out about greater pay for teachers in more disadvantaged areas, all of that makes sense. But I think actually what's holding a lot of kids back is the lack of integration of services around the individual, and the fact that they need not just the services of the school, but also a number of other services to really enable them to unlock opportunities. And it feels to me like austerity has held back a lot of the innovation in that space. And when I think back to things like Troubled Families, Total Place, there was more innovation in terms of how we integrate public services around people and therefore unlock greater opportunities for them. And I feel like it may not be in the white paper, but it would be, I think that's a central part of what we can do in terms of spreading opportunity. Second, I think there needs to be a greater focus on enterprise development. So obviously, Levelling Up has a big focus on the private sector, on R&D, on private sector investment. But in those communities, many of the ones that we work in, you're not going to get large-scale private sector investment, but you can grow enterprise from within. And we've funded over 1,000 now community-led businesses who are developing successful businesses in local communities, embedded in those communities and trading successfully. And the social economy is doing that much more broadly across thousands of places. So I think we need to see the engine of enterprise, self-employment, small business, the social economy unleashed, as well as the larger scale kind of private investment of large-scale corporates and other private businesses. Thirdly, I'd love to see a move away from the short-term funds that we've seen largely dominating some of the Levelling Up agenda so far, towards things that are much more akin to the town deals and the community. And I'd love to see a set of sub-town level deals, so community deals, which give communities greater control, greater say, but also critically, I think, build an institutional architecture that we could evolve over time into a longer-term structure at the neighbourhood level that could continue then to take power and control and funding from local authorities and central government, so that we start to build an infrastructure to support devolution going forward, because that's something that we don't currently have in this country, a neighbourhood level infrastructure to really support double devolution. So I think that could be the beginnings of something really important going forward. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Vidhya. I'm conscious that I don't want to hog the conversation up here, so please do start thinking about questions you might want to put to the panel. But if I may, just to use the prerogative as chair, ask a couple of questions just to kick us off. And Tom, I'll start with you, if that's okay. Mike talks about the fact that it's become quite vogue to talk about East Germany and see what lessons we can learn from what's happened there over a relatively long period of time. Rather than necessarily comment on East Germany, though please do if you want to, could you talk a little bit about how much appetite there is on the part of the group that you're working with, the ministers, to look at international examples and what might have worked or not worked? I think it's great that you've been to the devolved administrations, but presumably that's looking more at issues that exist rather than differences in approach. And where can we see successful sort of outcomes? And if you can link that at all to the white paper, great. But what sort of international examples are we looking at?
Yeah, so it's a good question. From Neil's leadership, I'm sure most of you know Neil O'Brien and his work at Onward on industrial strategy. He is an evidence-driven guy, and Andy Haldane the same, and then Michael Gove on top of that. So we are looking very hard at comparators. I think it is, and Stephen Aldrich, I should say, is here somewhere, chief analyst, who might want to sort of chip in on some of these later on. Chief analyst at DLUC, I should say, is here. Looking at all of these examples. I think one of the problems is the context of the UK is very particular, and the context of England, which is born out of its history, its geography. And so whether it's US or Europe, the constitutional settlement is very different. The physical geography of the country, i.e. distance, but also the topography is very different, and the history is very different. So you can look at examples, but there isn't an obvious if only we did what they did in wherever. Now, as it happens, Andy Haldane's work and the Industrial Council did look at some case studies, so the example of Lille, the example of San Antonio, and several other places, and in a sense they take you back to the sort of things I've already talked about: longevity, leadership, scale, flexibility, and that seems to me to be what the academic community comes to as well, through a whole range, academic and think tank. So yes, we look at case studies. There is interest in East Germany, and I think it's partly because there's this sort of statistic that hangs around that parts of England are at East German levels of productivity, so you sort of get it, and then you look at the great historic sweep where there was some, as I understand it, and I'm no expert, some convergence in East Germany, but they fired absolutely massive bazookas at it for 30 years with huge fiscal transfers, and so it's sort of a lesson in what can be done, but the case studies around, and indeed even within the UK context, I think pull you back to the things I've already said about leadership and about scale, about community engagement when it's at a more local level.
Great, thanks Tom. Michael, we were talking just before this panel started about the fact that Michael Gove's come in, obviously a high-powered minister with a sort of history of reform, better or worse, behind him, and he has a reputation as somebody who's going to be a real doer. But I was struck by some comments, I think earlier this week, from Justine Greening, who sort of struck a cautionary note and said if the Treasury on board with this agenda is not going to go anywhere. And in fact, she went further and said she thought that the Treasury wasn't fit for purpose in its current form, suggesting that if we're going to get serious about this, we'd have to put powers and funding into local government hands. Fiscal devolution's obviously one of the things which Treasury has been historically very reluctant to go anywhere near. Do you think that is a fair challenge on the part of Justine Greening? And do we think we need to reform Treasury, or do you think Treasury's serious about this agenda as you see it?
I'm conscious already we're expanding the agenda that Tom is going to be looking at in the white paper. So that is reforming Treasury is a big one. Can I just be really cheeky here and just offer a really brief answer as well to the previous question as well? Because I would suggest, Tom, it's worth looking at France. Not just in terms of the Lille example is very interesting, but in terms of the governance architecture for their, Macron's big initiatives around towns. And one specific thing that I think is really interesting, obviously very different. I take all the points you say, it's a different system and so on. But when they did their, I think it's the Cœur de Vie program, the selection of towns, which as here, you can imagine, is rather politically contentious. They started off, I think, with a model where they were going to ask towns to complete bids and to bid into a central process, and they scrapped that and have ended up. They actually, I think, they gave the préfet is the kind of authorised, sort of a senior figure in regional government, and they said, okay, you decide, and they decided on the basis of a basket of variables. So it's pretty transparent. Not everyone likes it, but the decision-making is pretty legitimate and pretty coherent. And I just think that's a very interesting thing to reflect on in the context of some of the funding schemes. Back to I wasn't dodging the Treasury question. I think there's two ways in which the Treasury really is important here. One, there's a devolution question, but there's also the question, the complicated question about the role of the Treasury in, I suppose, in shaping governmental decision-making about where resources go. And, there's been a lot of debate, obviously, about the Green Book in this regard. But more generally, some interesting, powerful analyses of the skew, the geographical skew, say, of R&D funding and so on. And we've got, this is clearly, primarily, a lot of this is to do with the Treasury. It's also, though, to do with the way in which our governing system operates and the sort of ingrained bias towards London and the South East as the place where you're going to get bang for your buck. So it's complicated, this. I think on the devolution question, I am very supportive of the idea of devolution, and particularly of extending out from this really slightly strange half-built model we've got. And I do think the ambition to do that in rural areas, which sounds as if we're going to be, it's what Tom and colleagues are wrestling with, sounds very important. Whether this is the moment to make a big push on fiscal devolution, I'm not sure about, actually. Though at the same time, the fiscal dimension of this is clearly very important. And that is clearly one of the missing pieces of the English devolution settlement. I think, on devolution, I would urge caution. It is a really tough nut, or set of nuts to crack. I think actually establishing new authorities takes time. We need to make sure we get that right. We need to make sure that we get the geographical scale for these new authorities absolutely right. We've got some good, I think the combined authority model has generally worked. We've innovated. It's by and large been successful. There'll be some quibbles about aspects of it. There's a lot to build out from. I would myself wait and see. I think the fiscal step comes a bit later.
Thanks, Mike. Vidhya, I'd love to get your perspective on that geographic scale. A lot of the things you've talked about are the real neighbourhood, grassroots initiatives, and quite a lot of this debate is around combined authorities, regional structures, maybe unitary authorities, counties, etc. Do you think you need both sides of that spectrum coming together? And then, if I may, a second question for you is, you sort of talk about social fabric. I was thinking about some of the sort of strengths and weaknesses we have as a country. We've got an unbelievable HE sector that is all around the country, in the devolved administrations, in the north, in the Midlands, great universities churning out great undergrad and research graduate students. And yet we still have this age-old problem. Are we not cranking the university lever hard enough, and what sort of trick are we missing there that places in the north, great universities, Leeds, Sheffield, Manchester, Lancaster, Newcastle, Durham, etc., aren't then getting the economic success we might want to see?
Okay, right. Well, my first question was about devolution. So, I think for me one of the biggest problems here is this hollowing out of local authorities. So we do a lot of work with combined authorities, and I'm really supportive of them. But I think some of this agenda sits much more locally, and what you see in local authorities now is in many of them an absence of leadership because of because of the last sort of 15 years. Has hollowed out a lot of that leadership, a lot of the capacity, and I think that makes it really difficult to do some of the much more local stuff that needs to happen. So in our experience, the best neighbourhood-based, community-based work happens in a strong partnership between community actors and local authorities. They're often presented as an either-or, like let's strip away local authorities and have it all at the community level, and that's just not in reality how it works. So the bit of this jigsaw that worries me is how we do levelling up effectively with quite a weak sort of local authority layer now, because of where we've been over the last 15 years, and a government that doesn't seem particularly enamoured of local authorities, and so I think that's for me is going to be quite challenging. In terms of HE, I don't think it's the absence of. I don't think levelling up is the failure of HE. It's a much more complex problem than that, and I think actually many of the opportunities that we need to create are for those people who don't go through the higher education system. So higher education institutions are not. I don't see where we are now as being a failure of higher education. There's a much more complex a complex set of issues going on that lead to regional inequality, and I think actually some of the universities that outside of the Russell Group, the kind of ones that we think about all the time, are doing brilliant work as civic universities. So I think about, the University of Gloucestershire repurposing the Debenhams in Gloucester. It's investing in the physical fabric of its place. And so some of the best work of universities as civic actors reinventing their places, I think, is outside of the prestigious core of universities that we often think about. So I think levelling up can't be laid at the door of the HE sector.
An area of opportunity, perhaps?
Yeah, definitely. I think I would love to see more of them play a greater civic role. I think they, as well as their sort of role as engines of education and opportunity, I think there's a real opportunity for them to really be civic actors, and they like the idea, but when in the conversations I have with them, they're struggling to understand what that means that they really do. But I think particularly outside the major cities, there is a huge amount that they can do in terms of being part of that local part of the regeneration locally, both of the physical fabric of the place, but also of the opportunities beyond the people who go through their doors. Like they can offer opportunity much more widely than that.
Great, thank you. I'm going to throw it open to the floor for any questions that we might have. If before you ask your question, you could just state your name and your organisation, that would be great. Start with you, sir.
Hi, I feel like a ninja wearing this. I apologise in advance for that, but it's personal here. I'm Pedro Brogel. Up until the end of last year, I was a career civil servant. I had a nice chat with Tom when I was sat in CLG, before the whole how do you pronounce it conspiracy started. Since then, I've moved to what we just referred to as the weak local authority layer. I just joined Westminster City Council 11 months ago. So I wanted to pick up on this latest issue that you've just been addressing, because Vidhya mentioned before about innovation at local level. And my experience from leaving Whitehall and coming across the local government is that there are loads of good ideas and some fantastic activity and innovation happening at that local level, exactly as Vidhya says, when you get that kind of interaction between local actors and local authority. Much of that is aligned with some of the key government objectives, so promoting enterprise or the journey to net zero. But what we often find is that there are policy blockers. I'm an oldie, but it just feels very visceral at the moment. There are some real sort of policy blockers, and what we've found is that it's then incumbent on the local authority or the community actors to try to bring together what ends up being disparate parts of Whitehall and knit that together into a sort of coherent picture to try and make a case for a local level innovation that could easily potentially be rolled out. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there a case for a hub within Whitehall to help support the kind of local innovation, to kind of give us a real easy way into the institution? Second point, just picking up on higher education, one of the things we found within Westminster is that quite a few of our high-value, high-growth companies start off as higher education spin-offs. So actually, it's not just that levelling up point about universities. This isn't just what they do with their own resources. It's also the kind of the innovation and the activity that they generate. Sorry, there's a couple of comments and questions.
That's great, thanks. I'll pick on particularly the point about the innovation hub, and maybe, Mike, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to cut, I recognise what you say. I think, just to sort of pull this into some of the things we've been talking about around levelling up, I think there's a very interesting question there anyway about what levelling up is going to do to structures in Whitehall. I mean, that's, it's interesting already in this conversation, as I'm sure Tom has noted, the sort of range of themes and policy areas that we've touched on has expanded and obviously moved into areas like education and so on, where there are already established departments. So, one of the really interesting things here as an outsider looking at this is when you've got this very ambitious, multifaceted domestic program, how is that going to be sort of developed, and then how are other parts of government going to be engaged around that, and priorities set and partnerships developed? What's that going to do to our very siloed structures of government? I think there's a very interesting thing there, which is separate to your innovation point, which sounds very sensible to me. Can I just make a quick point about universities? I think to complete the picture here, I think you're right, by the way. I think there's more interesting action on the spin-off side of things than on the sort of civic university side, though there are some good examples of that. But the problem there is a policy problem, is that the government policy, and this isn't just this government, this has been going on for, I think, 20 years at least, government policy to universities is fundamentally incoherent or points in different directions. The incentives that university managers have do not point towards putting a lot of emphasis and priority and investment in the civic university space. They point towards basically doing extremely well in your research rankings and so on. And until we really get to grips with the different purposes that universities are freighted with by government, and we develop a more coherent or integrated policy towards universities, I'm afraid we will not break out of that problem in this room.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, and I think I'll sort of very briefly speak for Tom. I think the fact that so much of this agenda now sits with the Cabinet Office, which obviously has its levers into all different parts of government, reflects the fact that they are very ambitious to make it a whole of government agenda, which perhaps it hasn't been in the past in quite the same way. Another question, please, sir.
Hi, I'm Matt Ferguson from the Tony Blair Institute. There's a big debate in the US, particularly around the Biden administration's infrastructure funding around childcare as infrastructure. And I wonder if the kind of panel could reflect on where they should go with greater childcare funding, because if you look at, well, higher education may be a strength in the UK, childcare at 0 to 3 is definitely a weakness with the UK grade group.
Thank you.
So I've just stopped paying £36,000 a year for childcare now that my youngest child is over 3. So that's a bit of a relief. I think the Nuffield Foundation has just released some really interesting sort of review work on childcare, and when I worked in government, it was on children in early years policy. So I think we haven't quite figured out what childcare is for, and we're always trying to square the circle. So despite having made a huge investment in universal entitlements for childcare, we still have a huge kind of out-of-pocket expense for parents. We don't, we talked about the universal entitlement as being about child development, and yet we still have a largely minimum wage workforce, which will never deliver the child development outcomes that we want. And so somehow, we looked at the Scandinavian models and sort of thought, yep, that's what we want. We want these, really high quality early education to really improve life chances. And that is very, very far away from what we have. But, it's an investment. Now it's all about priorities for investment, isn't it? I mean, to get the childcare system that would deliver on the child development outcomes that we hoped for it is going to take us substantially more money than the $6 billion we're already investing in the early years. I mean, I think if you look at all the literature on returns to education, it's the place where you should be investing in the education system, but I suspect that's not going to happen given all of the constraints on public spending. So is there a strong case for childcare to be considered infrastructure, both from a child development and life course perspective for children and what happens to them as adults, and then from a female employment and kind of unlocking? Yes, clearly, as with social care and others, but is it going to happen in the Levelling Up white paper? I really don't think so. And is it going to happen anytime soon? I also don't think so, because it's just now a case of tight public finance picture and many competing priorities.
Thanks, Vidhya. Graham.
Thank you, Graham Pendlebury. I used to work with DFT on local transport and local growth issues. My question is about the role of the private sector. We were told at the beginning that was going to be front and centre in the working with the agenda, but we've hardly heard anything about the private sector since then. It's all been about administrative machineries and things like that. So I'd like the panel to ask the question, what do they see the role of the private sector really being in this agenda? And in particular, in those small towns and run-down, left-behind places, which find it very difficult to attract private investment because there is no university, the local skills base is very low, and it's very difficult for businesses to scale up their activities once they've got their money in. So, private sector, please.
Thanks, Graham. I've been trying to protect Tom a little bit from the questions, but I'm not sure I've got the option here. So.
Graham and I used to work together, so it's a very good question. In fact, we used to share responsibility for local enterprise partnerships, which is kind of one of the questions at the heart of the white paper when it comes to sort of administrative geographies. I mean, Graham, you're completely right. One of the four outcomes is centred on growing the private sector, and particularly the sort of private sector where it's weakest. So that takes you to innovation policy, to business growth policy, some of the things that we've already heard about. I think there is then a different dimension. Look at the work of the Urban Taskforce, look at the new leadership at Homes England under Peter Freeman, ex of Argent, and Peter Denton, which is about leveraging private sector money into sort of back into the regeneration game, and then trying to do that not just in the city centres of our core cities, but as you said, in more peripheral places. And there you need real sort of financial imagination, because you've got to remove some of the risk, whether that's through grant funding to get people to go in the first place, or spreading the risk by creating a sort of portfolio of investment. So there is a huge role. I think it's just inevitably on these sorts of panels you turn to all the things the government is going to do and policy measures. So we would see, and I think the PM speech in July was clear on this, private sector is absolutely crucial, and none of this is about sort of chopping down tall poppies or reducing the role of the private sector. I also do think there's a big link to leadership. I mean, what the mayoral model does allow, the mayoral combined authority, is firstly the geographic scale, which becomes more interesting, I think, for private sector investors, including the prioritisation of intervention, but also, and Ben Houchen is always held up as the sort of figurehead of this, but the person you phone up and can do business with. So although we talk about public institutions and leadership, I think it's not just with an eye to it, it's absolutely central to how you get things done. Back to those points about international examples, Lille, wherever else, you always see a private-public partnership at the heart of it, based on those sort of principles of a clear strategy, investable propositions, strong leadership. So yes, I mean, that's a long answer to dial up the private sector.
Thanks, Tom. Vidhya, you can go.
So I'm quite persuaded by Martin Sambu's sort of argument about the economics of attraction and the need to actually improve the social fabric and physical fabric of places in order for some of those more peripheral places that you talked about to be able to attract private investment. So I think some of the some of the stuff that I've talked about, which maybe seems separate from the role of the private sector and the sort of economic outcomes of levelling up, I think is intimately linked, in that actually if we want greater private investment into some of these smaller towns, Grimsby's, Hartlepool's, some of the, are they places that people want to live? Can they attract employees? All of that stuff really matters. So I think that's where this sense that social fabric and economic outcomes really need to work together, I think becomes really important. And I mean, Martin talks about it in his book in terms of how you actually turn some of these places into places that can attract new investment, and some of it starts by actually addressing some of the features of the place. Are they places that anybody would want to raise their children to move to, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a link there.
Great, thank you. Question for you.
Thanks very much, Tara. I was from McKinsey. I'm also a trustee of Be the Business, which is actually trying to help the average business in this country, not the startup, not the scale-up, not the fintech, not the vaccine manufacturer, but the average business on the high street or the average businesses in one of these neighbourhoods. And I don't disagree that private sector has a huge role. So just one comment, and then I do come to a question. It's just really, really, really important to remember two statistics about R&D. 0.5% of businesses in the UK benefit from R&D tax credit at the minute. So what about the 99.5%? That's the rest, which is in all these communities that need to level up. And secondly, 85% of the people who benefit from it are men. So again, what about the other 50% of the population? I'm slightly exaggerating, but just kind of really want to remind people that we're not talking about people like us. We are talking about, the sort of citizen-centric, Vidhya talking about the individual actually, not even the local authority, not even the community, not even the neighborhood, but the individual needing to have a better life. That's where it comes from. And, we need to sort of turn the pyramid around, I think, in thinking. Sorry for a comment, but now my question is, one of the words I haven't heard in discussion is around trust. And when you look at the Scandinavian model, if you call it that, part of the reason why they're somewhat more successful in this sort of thing is because citizens do trust the local institutions. They trust the police, they trust the health service, they trust the education system, they trust the child services. And that then makes them be more communitarian and do stuff for the local community that's better for everybody else. They get into a virtuous cycle of maybe not pride as much as just kind of a belonging in a place. And I was really curious to hear, and it's great that public sector actually has a big role in the levelling up agenda, but like to what degree are we also addressing that issue around trust?
Thank you. Michael, anything to come back on?
Can I talk quickly about trust, because I think it's a really interesting question. I think partly I'm thinking of some of the work we did for the social infrastructure piece was around looking at mutual aid activity during COVID, and we were just sort of struck that there was a pretty strong correlation between those places that had more infrastructure for their community life and those places that were more likely to have a mutual aid group or community coming together. And I mean, that was a slightly depressing thing, or very depressing thing to read in the context of social infrastructure, though I think a very powerful argument for it. But also it did strike me that trust in the UK context is, and maybe we're similar to the US in this, I think. It works in a formal versus informal way. I think what the problem, I would nuance your statement of the problem, I think, is that there's a very significant low levels of trust, decline of trust in some of our formal public institutions, particularly institutions of governance. And what you see is that at the same time, though, there are new forms of coming together, and there's quite a rich veins of volunteering, community life, and so on. But those do tend to track onto more affluent type communities. I mean, there's an issue there about measurement. I know that people who've done this sort of work will know. It's complicated, but it does seem to me that what we've got to do is not, I don't necessarily buy the argument that trust is just in complete free fall, But I do think that actually people are more likely to be trusting of entities in which they feel some sort of stake or they may have participated or with which they connect in certain ways. And I think the challenge for policymakers is to try to understand that and harness it. Otherwise, we get ourselves into a very sort of difficult declinist spiral where we're perpetually thinking that the world, it was all great before and now it's all gone to the dogs. No, I don't think that's true. I think there's some quite important shifts there about people's feelings of belonging and connection that we need to think about.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to take two final questions before we wrap up. One from Zoe and one from that gentleman there, please.
Thanks, Nick. Zoe Vidhya from the Centre for Progressive Policy. Great to be here. I just want to pick up on two narratives that came out of conference season. Two quite different narratives, so bear with me. But the first one was there's been quite a change, I would say, in the sort of traditional Conservative narrative of get on the bike, so go and get yourself a job or a good job. And actually, a lot of the narrative that's coming out, especially with Michael Gove's speech, was sort of success is being able to live your life basically from where you grew up or where you come from. So I'm just kind of interested in your reflections on whether that's a fair assessment of where the agenda's going and is sort of staying put going to be a success indicator, and should it be a success indicator of the Levelling Up agenda? And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I'm just thinking
Sorry, would you mind just...
I'm not with any particular institution, so I was just thinking if the sort of essence of Levelling Up is moving or creating new high GPA jobs in different areas of the country, could we not sort of take an Occam's razor approach to all this and try and do it all through the tax system? So just have locally specific employers NI or something like that, which just incentivises people to move high GPA jobs to low-income areas and vice versa. And then let that flow through private enterprise and wash out that way. It'll give employers a very strong incentive to position jobs in areas that need a higher income, and then you get trickle down.
Great, thanks. I'm going to combine those two questions and give the final word to Tom. Is the irony of the Levelling Up agenda that the net zero agenda no longer relies on us getting on bikes? We can all just stay put and walk to work with these high GVA jobs engineered through the tax system?
Yeah, I mean, they're sort of mega political questions, aren't they? I mean, it's interesting, like, to answer slightly more generally on stay put, we've been looking at a whole load of metrics, and as this discussion shows, the agenda is vast. I think certainly rates of mobility are an indicator almost of the problem. So if you, bring train to London to the southeast, so if you take that as problem definition, sort of some sense of movement the other way would be success. I don't think we'll go as far as saying that the sort of goal is you stay put and freedom of movement within the UK. And similarly, I mean, tax, I shouldn't sort of stray into fiscal arguments, I'll get into big trouble. But it's kind of quite an interesting thought experiment. I think that is what I would say. I guess here you're still, what are we trying to do overall? Is still grow the economy, and it's for business to decide where to locate. And how public policy can sort of ease that or remove the disincentives is probably the better way. But I like both of these questions because they sort of push the boundary, really, of what policy might do. Good questions to end on.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, and hopefully, I think my understanding is right that we will only have to wait for a moment in time soon, as opposed to a moment in time in due course, before we see the fruits of Tom and everyone's labours. But we've clearly given Tom and fellow panellists a lot of food for thought. It's a huge topic, and we've covered a lot of areas. Thank you all, and if you could please thank the panel.